Hello, welcome to Kopi Time, a podcast series on markets and economies from DBS Group Research. I'm Taimur Beg, Chief Economist, welcoming you to our 136th episode. In the last episode of this podcast, we discussed techno-nationalism with Alex Capri. And today we will talk about Taiwan, where tech and nationalism and security all get blended together. We will have a keen Taiwan watcher to do that. Drew Thompson is a senior fellow at the S. Rajaratnam School of International Studies at Nanyang Technological University. He's also a part-time senior research scientist at the CNA Corporation. He's been with the Lee Kuan Yew School of Public Policy at the National University of Singapore in the past, and from 2011 to 2018, he was the director for China, Taiwan, and Mongolia in the Office of the Secretary of Defense in the United States, where he was responsible for supporting the secretary and managing military-to-military relations. Drew Thompson, a warm welcome to Kopi Time.
Thank you for having me.
It's great to have you, Drew. I want to talk about Taiwan today with you, and let's begin with Taiwan's President Lai Ching-te, known also as William Lai, but I think you just told me earlier that he doesn't go with you by William anymore, so I will refer to him as President Lai, if I may. President Lai has been in power for about 4 months. In a recent article, I think you talked about his 100 days, where he said that the view and degree of satisfaction with Lai's 100 days so far differ considerably in Taipei, Beijing, and Washington. Walk us through those multiplicity of assessments.
Sure. So actually, I was asked by the publisher to submit an article because they'd read a piece in a Chinese outlet that basically said how bad Lai's first 100 days were, and the editor thought there's really more to it than Beijing's perspective. So I really think it does come down to sort of President Lai and his domestic contacts, as well as Beijing and Washington, of course. So maybe starting with President Lai, I think he's managed his transition pretty well. I mean, he hit the ground running, which is the advantage of being the former vice president. He's certainly got an advantage in that the Taiwan economy is doing quite well. I mean, it's in good shape. It's, growth, GDP growth is like 3% or so. They predict it to maybe go up a little. Inflation's under 2% and unemployment's at 3%. So you've got pretty much full employment. And then in the sentiment index, you've got the Taiwan stock market being one of the best performing in Asia, and it's up over 30% in the first half of the year. So things are kind of going his way domestically. He has a parliament, the legislative yuan, that's controlled by the opposition party Kuomintang, the KMT, and since they control the legislature, that's a potential political challenge for him. They've thrown a couple shots across his bow, and I think he's dealt with them pretty effectively so far. But that's going to be an ongoing challenge for him. But he so far managed it well. I mean, he's like any president, certainly very astute about his own domestic politics. He's had a long run in politics as a former mayor, so he knows the political field and plays it well. He has, I think, done something rather unique in that he's really set an agenda that he's been able to push. And one of the ways he's done that is he's formed 3 presidential level committees, similar to what the U.S. would have in what we call the interagency, sort of multi-department, multi-government agency meetings that he chairs. And one of them is on climate change, another on healthcare, and the last one is on whole of society resilience. And I think the whole of society resilience campaign is pretty new, and I think that makes it pretty potentially impactful, and I think it's worth watching. It's intended, as they said, to coordinate government efforts as well as mobilize society. And it's not just homeland defense against blockades or invasions or the threat of natural disasters, which they face. There's a typhoon currently hitting Taiwan. But it's really about mobilizing civilians to be prepared and get basic training for like medical and emergency responder training. And that's an area where NGOs in the private sector can step in. It's also about strengthening critical infrastructure, including the power, financial system, wartime communications, and also reducing their vulnerability to disruptions in undersea cables. So, and the last thing I think they're really focusing on is stockpiling energy, food and emergency medical supplies so that they can withstand either a prolonged natural disaster or a blockade, for example. So I think, this is a pretty new and innovative and potentially game-changing approach to resilience in Taiwan. But I think it also is really important because of the signaling aspect. So rather than focusing on like how much natural gas Taiwan could stockpile and who's going to pay for it, I think it's going to change the population's mindset and probably raise their morale and maybe strengthen the will to resist, which is a big issue. And so it's going to give him political support to stand up to bullying and protect Taiwan's autonomy in the face of aggression. So basically, he's empowering the Taiwan people to take their future into their own hands. That obviously doesn't make Beijing happy.
Drew, once again,
KMT happy either.
Drew, before we go to Beijing, I just want to stay with Taipei for 1 second. Sorry about interrupting.
Yeah, please.
So how popular is he with these pivots that you just talked about?
So, these are fairly new developments. The first committee meeting he held was last week. So I don't think there's a reflection yet in the public polling. He's doing pretty well in public polls. As good as they are, he's at around the 50% mark, which is quite good. In a way, the risk is that his popularity is going to decrease because there's really nowhere else to go. So I think he's got strong support. It's interesting to note that commentators in Beijing, keep pointing out that he only got 40% of the vote in the last election, and that's an indication that he's not supported by the public. But they don't often mention that it was a three-way race, and that the vote was split. So he didn't get an absolute majority, but he definitely won handedly against the other two candidates.
Great.
So Beijing. Yes. Beijing is in a way sort of their approach to Taiwan since he's been elected is essentially unchanged. It's very static. Lai is his existence is a provocation to Beijing. When a couple of years ago, around 2017, he said sort of off the cuff that he called himself a pragmatic worker for Taiwan independence. And I think that really stuck in Beijing's mind. And as a result, even when Lai Ching-te is trying to be accommodating or trying to be self-restrained, Chinese commentators will often say, well, he's just hiding his true nature, or he's a diehard independent separatist and he's irredeemable. So basically, he has to face a pretty tense and difficult cross-strait relationship from the day he was elected, and there's really very little prospect for cross-strait engagement because China positions it as a precondition that he accept the one China principle, and that pretty much rules out dialogue between them because it's not acceptable to his electorate. So the other thing is that Beijing really doesn't have any assurances to offer Taiwan, very few incentives, and those incentives that they do offer are not terribly attractive. So China's tried to offer economic integration as a potential carrot to get Taiwan closer to the mainland, but it becomes less effective when China's economy is not doing as well. Taiwan companies are struggling to be profitable and succeed in the market or enter the market. But more importantly, China has used trade as a political coercion tool more than once, including against Taiwan. They've cut off tourists since 2016. 2020, there was a pretty dramatic incident, 2021, where China has embargoed pineapples from Taiwan. So suddenly, Taiwan pineapple farmers have lost their major market, and it became a rallying cry for divestiture from China and for de-risking. And that's been driving Taiwan businesses away from the mainland and into places like Southeast Asia. So that kind of leaves Beijing's main policy tool and sort of go-to response to deal with policy differences, it's military coercion. And it's just not working on the people of Taiwan. It may serve the interests of leadership in Beijing in terms of demonstrating to their people that they are resolved to oppose Taiwan independence and anything that goes against Beijing's interests. But the military tool is not convincing the people of Taiwan that they should form some sort of confederation with China. In fact, it's driving people to be more supportive of a higher degree of autonomy and resilience against the mainland, which is continually running military missions around Taiwan, across the center line, in increasingly complex military maneuvers. So,
Drew, one question on Beijing. Its engagement or efforts to coerce or show them with some carrots. Either way, your point that it's not really has had any impact on improving the relationship or changing the mind of the Taiwanese political leadership. I think that's well taken. But it is still the fact that despite all the talk of de-risking, Taiwan remains a very large investor in China, and you do have many Taiwanese professionals gainfully employed in China.
There's been a dramatic exodus of Taiwanese expats from the mainland back to Taiwan and increasingly to other places. Not considering the total stock of foreign direct investment, but if you look at new foreign direct investment, I think the last year, 2 years, the amount of Taiwan foreign direct investment going to Southeast Asia and South Asia, primarily India, is exceeding what goes to China. And I think if you add it up with what's going to the United States, there are clear indications that there is de-risking going on in the cross-strait economic relationship. It's also borne out in the identity issue. We can talk about that some more, but essentially the Taiwanese people increasingly self-identify as Taiwanese, not as Chinese. Now they may speak Chinese language, they have a shared history, but that's changing in Taiwan as well.
Good point. All right, we'll come back to Beijing a little later, but walk us through Washington's assessment of FLY.
Sure. So, Washington is always going to be nervous about cross-strait relations when they're tense. They are going to be concerned about the risk of miscalculation, whether that's China miscalculating, Taiwan miscalculating, or even Washington itself. So I think Washington is going to be concerned about Lai possibly antagonizing Beijing, because he'll be pursuing a balance between protecting Taiwan's autonomy and their dignity, and at the same time showing some restraint so that he's not overtly antagonizing Beijing. And I think that's an important posture that he has to continually manage and calibrate. And I think that's the context by which Washington views most of Taipei's actions. Obviously, there's strong support in Washington for human rights, self-determination, particularly with a liberal government in Washington. But there are limits to that. It can't come at the expense of U.S. interests, and U.S. interests are stable cross-strait relations. So we'll certainly see Washington continuing to monitor Lai's behaviors, his speeches. In a couple of days, on October 10th, he'll give a National Day speech, and I think there will be plenty of think tankers in Washington and Beijing analyzing word by word what he says and scrutinizing it for evidence about whether he's diverging from the status quo. But I think Lai Ching-te will thread that needle well. Tsai Ing-wen certainly did it for 8 years, and I think at the end of the day, Washington is going to be satisfied that that Lai Ching-te is considering U.S. interests as he postures himself and communicates with his own people. Beijing is not going to be happy, and at the end of the day, though, for Lai Ching-te, it's really Washington's continued support that's what really matters the most. And I think importantly, and I mentioned this in the essay, Lai Ching-te has done a pretty good job building a rapport and a relationship with Washington and the U.S. government. It started before the inauguration in May. Remember, it's a very long interregnum in Taiwan between the election in January and inauguration in May. And the Biden administration had pretty strong connections even before the election with all of the political parties that were running. And that really helps build trust and a sense of confidence that U.S. interests will be protected, that Taiwan candidates are not going to be reckless. And I think he's done a good job developing that trust. But that said, he never gets a free pass. He won't get a free pass from Washington. So I think Washington, D.C. and its perceptions are a risk that he'll have to continually manage looking ahead.
The perception from Washington, D.C. is a function of who's a president, or there's a little more structural, beyond political cycle sort of stance on Taiwan?
I mean, at its best, Washington's foreign policy is based on national interests. It tends to be in the context of allies and partners, coming as the primary interest, as well as access and influence. And that's really irregardless of the party in power, both in Washington or in Taipei. These are two governments that have long experience dealing with one another. Very, very experienced bureaucracies and professional career civil servants that manage the relationship in multiple administrations. As the political leaders shift, the managers of the relationship do not. And I think there may be an element of risk, but it's basically a manageable one. The KMT presidency, certainly we saw this under Ma Ying-jeou, had a very different cross-strait characteristic than the Taiwan administration, but the U.S. can deal with that just as a Taiwan administration can deal with shifts in Washington politics as well.
All right. Well, we'll talk about some more later. I'm curious about that issue. But just staying with President Lai's, performance so far. So, okay, 100 days. You think that he has done pretty well from Taiwan's perspective. He has not surprised Washington, and Beijing, of course, is not going to be happy. What about the next 3.5 years? What lies ahead?
Yeah, as Yogi Berra said, right, making predictions is difficult, especially about the future. But that said, we can monitor trends, and I don't see big paradigm shifts from what we've already seen. He's going to have to manage a host of known risks. Some of them including demographic risk of an aging, shrinking society and the impact that has on the economy and society and security. He's got domestic political and economic risks. As I said, managing an opposition party that's quite empowered and runs the legislature. He's got to manage cross-strait risks. He's got to manage Washington. And at the same time, he's also looking to strengthen relations with Japan and with Europe. And those have been trending upwards as well. So that's added to his workload. As I mentioned before, his polls are quite high. So it's pretty certain his popularity will fall. That may not be a horrendous thing if it gives him guidance in terms of what the people of Taiwan wants and how to deliver it. But I think those are all pretty well-known knowns. There is a risk of, I think, some exogenous shocks, unexpected ones. He'll have to deal with that are really kind of irrespective of cross-strait relations or maybe Washington. You've got global economic downturn risk. Global rise in inflation would be pretty hard on Taiwan because inflation is currently quite low. Wages have not been increasing dramatically. Standard of living is high, but wages have not been going up. So a kick in global inflation would hurt. If you had additional stress in the global supply chain and system of trade, Trump is threatening 60% tariffs on China. If that comes to be, that'll be difficult on those Taiwan companies that still have manufacturing in China. But that's, as I said, trending downward and trending outward. So maybe what's more threatening would be Trump in initiating 10% tariffs across the board on every country, which would hurt Taiwanese operating in the mainland, Taiwan, and Southeast Asia. So for trade-dependent countries like Taiwan, like Singapore, this could be a major risk that is difficult to prepare for. It's important to know that Taiwan's top export destination is still China, but the U.S. is catching up, and it's probably going to exceed total exports in the near future. And again, I think that's a growing trend as manufacturing hubs shift out of China into Southeast Asia. Chinese factories are increasingly focused on supplying the Chinese market. You're going to see the importance of the U.S. as an export destination rise. It's already Singapore's top export destination, and it's going to, I think, very shortly be one for Taiwan as well. So I think having the U.S. close itself off to imports would certainly hurt Taiwan. I think there's another major risk that everybody has to contend with is what emanates from Beijing. We saw Beijing last week implement stimulus, but that wasn't expected. I think that maybe took longer than most people hoped for. We saw China very unexpectedly shift away from its zero COVID stance and just open everything up and return to normal, which certainly had costs on the Chinese people as well as the society. So there's an unpredictability emanating from Beijing that I think Lai Ching-te and everyone else is going to have to deal with. And maybe ultimately the mother of all political risks is, what happens if Xi Jinping suddenly departs the scene? There's no anointed successor. There's no agreed to norms for succession. So, if Xi Jinping suddenly, gets called for a meeting with Marx, Beijing's palace politics could get very sporty, and we're all going to have to deal with that, but Lai Ching-te in particular.
Yes, no shortage of unpredictability these days. I want to stay with this U.S.-Taiwan trade and investment relationship a little more. As you know, Drew, TSMC is a singular point of vulnerability as well as opportunity for Taiwan because no other company makes what TSMC makes with the quantity and precision, and the U.S. administration is very keen on reducing the risk of all of those things being made in Taiwan. So we've seen under the IRA, lots of incentives being given to Taiwanese manufacturers to build in the U.S. So when we talk about the next 3.5 years of Lai's presidency, would he be a cheerleader of Taiwanese companies building in Texas or Arizona? Or would he try to tread the balance because he does want that core excellence to stay in Taiwan because that is Taiwan's branding and source of power?
Yeah, between the IRA and the CHIPS Act, the U.S. is suddenly very attractive for this type of manufacturing. I think it's also important it's not just TSMC, right? TSMC is very much a product of its own supply chains. There's a tremendous ecosystem of companies that support TSMC and its processes. So it's not just TSMC setting up a factory, it's the whole supply chain to that fabrication plant moving with it, and many of those are Taiwanese. So it's potentially a pretty massive footprint that'll ultimately emerge. I don't think Lai Ching-te is terribly concerned because TSMC is committed to keeping the most cutting edge of the cutting edge in Taiwan. That's where they perform at their highest efficiency levels. It's where the top engineers are. They definitely see Arizona as an important component of their global manufacturing, just as they also manufacture in China too. So I think there's going to be diversified footprints, but I don't think Lai is concerned about the semiconductor industry hollowing out from Taiwan itself, partly because that infrastructure to support it, not only in the sub-suppliers, but also in the human capital sector, and really the incredible work ethic of Taiwan engineers who are highly incentivized to work incredibly hard in Taiwan. Plus, pretty good standard of living, fairly low cost standard of living makes it pretty competitive. So I don't think they're worried about losing that. I think there's enough semiconductor demand from the highest levels to lower levels that TSMC's position in Taiwan itself is pretty secure. So they can afford to diversify. And I think that's Taiwan's benefit as well at the end of the day.
Okay, so speaking of diversification, you've touched upon this briefly earlier. Let's go a little deeper on this, which is Taiwan vis-a-vis Southeast Asia. There's a lot of trade and commerce between this region and Taiwan. And in the context of de-risking of supply chains, I think there'll be far more going forward. What do you hear from the president and his administration as far as their Southeast Asia strategy is concerned?
Sure. So the Taiwan-Southeast Asian relationship is really quite interesting. I won't get into the history, but I mean, I've been watching and traveling to Taiwan for more than 20 years, and it's intriguing for me to watch the change, particularly in the last, say, 10 years, how Southeast Asia is becoming much more relevant in and to Taiwan. So, I mean, I think the two Taiwan and the Southeast Asian region, they're really becoming very increasingly intertwined. And maybe I'd describe that as two trends, right? So call it an inward trend and an outward trend. So, first of all, remember, Taiwan's not small. It's very tempting to sit back and say, wow, China's so big and Taiwan is so small. But Taiwan is neither small nor significant. I mean, if you group it economically with Southeast Asia, Taiwan would be the second largest economy after Indonesia, and it would be the second wealthiest per capita after Singapore. So as the relationship changes, Taiwan becomes increasingly important in a way to Southeast Asia. So on that outbound side, we're now seeing Taiwan companies increasingly investing in Southeast Asia and South Asia more than they do in China. I think that's an inevitable trend here. We talked about Taiwan companies being sort of central to these global supply chains. It's not just semiconductors, it's ICT across the board, OEM part suppliers. So that electronic sector is really pretty critical. And we saw that during COVID when everybody began working from home and they were buying new cameras and new monitors and new computers, and Taiwan's exports soared during COVID to supply that. So I think as manufacturers from around the world, including Taiwan, shift their production to Southeast Asia, you'll see a supply chain from Taiwan following those clients. And that's primarily landing in Singapore, Vietnam, Indonesia, and Thailand for the most part. I think some in Malaysia, but less. But on the inbound side, we'll call it the inbound side, you've got more Southeast Asians becoming part of the fabric of Taiwanese society. So Taiwan's society is shrinking. Their population is shrinking. Fertility rate is like 1.25, which is one of the lowest in the world. So basically, for every couple, you have 1.25 children being born. The sustainment rate for a population is 2.2. So Taiwan is basically running out of people, and they have been for a fairly long time. And Southeast Asians are stepping in to fill the gaps in the workforce, and they're playing a really important role in Taiwan's economy, but that also means in their society. So the official statistic is that there are about 760,000 Southeast Asians living in Taiwan, but there's actually probably a sizable number that are not counted, so it's probably closer to 1 million. And this is in a population of 23 million, so it's a pretty big chunk. And they primarily come from Indonesia, Vietnam, and the Philippines. And as I said, it's a big number of people. So when you walk around in downtown Taipei or a major city, particularly in the affluent areas, you see shops catering to Southeast Asians. They're selling sambal and Southeast Asian products and services and shipping boxes back to Southeast Asian states. And there's a prominent chain called Toko Indo that you can find in sort of back alley, neighborhoods, and where the domestic helpers and the service workers can go and buy their comfort food and ship their boxes home and transfer money, and you see Indonesian caregivers escorting the seniors in the markets doing their shopping on the weekends and in the mornings. It's an increasingly common sight. So you basically got a lot of Southeast Asians living in the homes of Taiwanese. So you've got some cross-cultural exchanges going there in the major cities, but you're also seeing that in the industrial centers, particularly from Indonesia, Vietnam. You've got a lot of factory workers, a lot of skilled laborers who are working in these factories, particularly down south. So you can just go to a shopping center and see a lot of signage in different Southeast Asian languages where they're providing services and information. You're also seeing this in the government. Public-facing departments are communicating in up to 7 languages now. I was almost surprised the Taiwan government's news agency started issuing, they started a Bahasa language service in July. So it's really changing Taiwan. And so even though countries don't recognize Taiwan for the most part diplomatically, this labor trend is internationalizing Taiwan in a way. And I think there's maybe 2 big implications for this. I mean, obviously, there's a social impact. 5% of the population, give or take, is from Southeast Asia. And that's going to change Taiwan's identity, right? And Taiwan is increasingly dependent on diversity. And that's going to make Taiwan even more distinct from China. Then you've got political and security implications. Taiwan's security interests align more closely with Southeast Asia than they ever have before. I was doing some research on countries opposed, basically which countries had opposed China's aggression in the South China Sea. So I Googled Vietnam, Indonesia, pick a couple countries, and Google Indonesia condemns China's Coast Guard ramming a Philippine vessel. No public statements from any of the Southeast Asian states, but the number 1 hit on Google is Taiwan Ministry of Foreign Affairs decries China ramming Philippine vessel. So you have Taiwan is a very vocal supporter of these sorts of peaceful resolution of conflict, international norms, and that means there's a security alignment of interest. So even though the potential for cross-strait conflict is low, it's not imminent, it's not inevitable, but you've got 1 million Southeast Asians living on Taiwan who'd be pretty adversely impacted if a conflict occurs. And there's, of course, economic consequences too, right? It's not just the remittances, but the impact on global trade. And I think the polls in Southeast Asia are starting to show Southeast Asian elites increasingly opposing China using force against Taiwan. It doesn't mean they're willing to stand up to Taiwan or denounce them publicly, but they definitely have an interest in not having a conflict occur. So the question will be what Southeast Asia prepared to do to deter China from using force. And at this point, there's not much, but I think as that trend continues, we may see some change.
So the trend is certainly fascinating. And I actually want you to look a little further east from Southeast Asia, or rather, look west, India. I've seen recent stories that Indian Navy have cooperation with the Vietnamese Navy, or Indian companies are exploring Southeast Asia as part of the supply chain that they could take advantage in their pursuit for manufacturing excellence. Do you see Taiwan-India relationship feature in a prominent manner when you read like Taiwanese media, for example?
I would hardly consider myself an expert on the Taiwan-India relationship, but my sense is that it's growing. There are now a number of prominent Indian scholars who are resident in Taiwan in academia doing national security research. The Taiwan government just signed an agreement with India to facilitate migrant workers coming to India. I mentioned you've got potentially 1 million Southeast Asians. Taiwan is looking to bring in South Asians as well. So I think maybe those are 2 examples. The Indian representative office in Taiwan is active and meets with officials and does representation and provides facilitation for businesses to invest in Taiwan. We've certainly seen one of the biggest Taiwan companies, Honhai Precision, Foxconn, which assembles iPhones and other Apple products, setting up factories in India. So I think the potential for that relationship to grow is definitely there, but it's been starting from what I think is a fairly low base. But again, I think Taiwan's interest is in internationalizing. So if Taiwan businesses are looking for opportunities to invest in India, I'm sure India will welcome them. And likewise, if the big Indian companies, the Tatas of the world, want to engage in Taiwan, the Taiwan economic ministries will certainly help them find suitable partners, suitable locations, and facilitate their inbound investments as well. So I think it's a relationship primed to expand for sure.
Okay, since I'm dragging you around the region, Drew, I might as well take you up north a little bit now. Quick comments: Taiwan, Japan, Taiwan, Korea.
Good one. Taiwan, Korea, smaller, less potential, but certainly plenty of overlap. I mean, in some ways, I think painting a broad brush, Taiwan companies in many ways compete with South Korean ones in places like Southeast Asia. Certainly, the South Korean companies like Samsung are quite prominent, and at the same time, I'm sure they have plenty of Taiwanese suppliers who contribute to their assembly work in Vietnam and elsewhere. So I think it's both symbiotic, but certainly politically, South Korea hasn't had much interest in Taiwan or the cross-strait relationship. South Korea has been very focused on its security issues with the North Koreans and China's support for North Korea, as well as the survival of South Korean businesses in China. So I think that's been primarily the focus, and there hasn't been, for instance, not expecting to hear news that South Korean arms manufacturers are preparing to provide platforms or munitions to Taiwan. You rarely hear South Korean politicians talk about Taiwan, but Japan is a completely different matter. When Tsai Ing-wen was elected in 2016 and Prime Minister Abe was in office, you had really a confluence of interests where Prime Minister Abe had a very close relationship with Taiwan, had an affinity for them, and likewise the President Tsai and her party, the DPP, and President Lai's party have an affinity for Japan. I think there's been an awakening in Japan about the security risks that China presents to the Japanese homeland, and Taiwan is a very important part of that. Japanese politicians will sometimes say that if you stand on the southernmost parts of Japan, you can see Taiwan from Yonaguni Island. So Japan is concerned about the security of the Southwest Islands, and therefore there's been a lot of investment in building military infrastructure around the Ryukyu chain, and as a result, from Okinawa down to Yonaguni, you've got an increasingly aware and prepared and postured Japan self-defense force. I mentioned, socially, I think there's a lot. Japanese culture is very popular in Taiwan. People can forget, that Taiwan is not the home of Hello Kitty, not the birthplace of Hello Kitty, but you wouldn't know it. So I think Japanese culture very, very popular in Taiwan. The economy, the economic relationship also quite close, and the security relationship is increasing. They don't have diplomatic recognition, but the Japanese Defense Ministry has posted a serving official for the first time to Taiwan, not retired officials and retired officers as they had in the past. So that's a very small upgrade, but it's important for the Japanese Defense Ministry to understand what's going on in Taiwan and Taiwan's military, and have an open channel that they can count on. So I think Japan has a very heightened concern about the military threat from China and the prospect for a cross-strait conflict, and that's becoming apparent in Japan's posture towards Taiwan.
Okay, Drew, you're nudging me into the next segue very, very seamlessly. In a recent article, you wrote, I quote, China is steadily increasing coercive measures against Taiwan, but they remain to date below the threshold of military conflict. Essentially, when does coercion end and conflict begin? Question mark, end quote. All right, let's be clear. You're not making a prediction for a war here, but your objective is to deepen the understanding of the risks of conflict. So with that context, please walk us through the threshold scenario, Drew.
So, yeah, I appreciate the caveat. I mean, when one is engaged in defense planning, it can be a somewhat dark place. You're thinking about the worst possible outcomes, the failure of diplomacy and the prosecution of a war, and that's hard. So just because you're planning for it doesn't mean you want it. What it really means is you want to avoid it, you want to prevent it, you want to deter it. So one of the things I've been thinking about for a very long time is, and particularly as I mentioned, China's military coercion against Taiwan has increased very steadily, especially since August 2022 when Speaker Pelosi visited. That coercion has become normalized. The Chinese Navy regularly sails ships around Taiwan, including aircraft carriers. They fly surveillance planes, bombers regularly all around Taiwan. Fighter planes cross the center line on an almost daily basis. It looks quite touchy. And I think as we become normalized to that regular, steady military coercion, you also recognize there's a lot of other coercion going on: diplomatic, economic, informational. Sometimes the Taiwanese call that cognitive warfare. It's all designed to impose political pressure on Taiwan. Oftentimes it's called gray zone, below the threshold of conflict, any of these activities. So the question for me is, as it increases, is there a tipping point? At what point does it become war? And it's pretty critical moment to consider, because if you've got tensions rising and a conflict is becoming increasingly apparent, at what point do you cross that threshold? And I think it's important for businesses as well as governments and militaries to sort of recognize this, because that normalization of military coercion makes people complacent. And you may not be aware of the indications of the change in the phase. And I think that also has really important implications for how the U.S. responds. So there's a very natural tension within the U.S. government between the civilians, the diplomats, the White House, who really want to use diplomatic means to avoid conflict. And that bumps up against military officials who also want to avoid a conflict, for sure, but they need to move forces to prepare for the start of the war. They need to move forces from the U.S. mainland, from Guam, from Hawaii towards the conflict, and they need to posture themselves to be able to take advantage of the opening phases from a position of strength, right? The first mover's advantage. Some military officers might advocate for a show of force as a means to deter China. But the diplomats that are looking for negotiated solutions don't want to do anything to provoke Beijing, because they're looking for an off-ramp from the road to war. And that's going to be a natural tension, because diplomats, the White House, are not necessarily going to want the military to move forces very visibly closer to a potential conflict, because it might hurt their chances for a negotiated peaceful solution. And you run a risk. And I think we saw that a little bit in Ukraine. We've seen it in past historic cases where negotiations tend to supplant military preparations. So I think that that's a pretty key tipping point that we have to understand, so that we're not behind the curve, and that we're not showing restraint when the other side is preparing for a conflict and ready to move, or potentially even using diplomatic negotiations as a ruse, as a means to obscure and prevent the adversary from using their military to their own advantage.
Your view on the U.S. Taiwan policy under Trump versus Harris. You've already talked about this a bit, but just specifically under Trump or under Harris, how do you see U.S. Taiwan policy evolve?
Yeah, as I mentioned, I'm also reluctant to make predictions about the future. I I think there's very little to go on. I mean,
they haven't said much, right?
Yeah, U.S. elections and the rhetoric that accompanies them are primarily domestic. That's what the voters care about. So we really can just speculate on what either administration will do. So I think let's make the assumption that Washington's China, Taiwan, Asia policy is part of sort of an overarching approach to Asia. The relationship with treaty allies will take precedent. And strengthening partnerships is kind of an instinct or a perpetual foreign policy goal for Washington. That's kind of left to its own devices, the way Washington would go. So I think those are U.S. constants. And you can say, well, Trump is hard on allies or not. Trump is very crude when he's talking about allies. But if you're going to be kind, what he's essentially pushing for is reciprocity and what's sometimes referred to as burden sharing, basically trying to establish the value to the United States of a bilateral relationship in a security treaty. And I think that's healthy. I think the way Trump maybe approaches it isn't necessarily healthy, but let's get back to the constants. You've got the alliances, you've got U.S. interests in access, influence, markets, the desire to strengthen partnerships. You've got the other major constant in Xi Jinping. He's going to affect either administration equally, so you have to take that into account. I think Xi Jinping's foreign policy and national security objectives are not always aligned with U.S. interests. Xi Jinping can be very uncompromising in his approaches. I mean, he set a goal for China, whether it's the China dream or his economic policies that don't take into account U.S. interests necessarily. So I don't think there's a lot of room for negotiation or somehow fundamentally changing the paradigm. The U.S. isn't just going to surrender, and neither is China. So I mentioned that Xi Jinping can also be unpredictable, so throw everything out that I say. And we don't have visibility into the policymaking process. But I think it's a fairly low probability that he's going to wake up one morning and say, I've misread the United States. They're not an ideological and security threat to us. Let's be friends. I don't think he's headed there. So I think competition is going to be a feature for the next administration, not only because of how Xi Jinping sees the relationship between the Communist Party and everything outside the party, including the West. Competition is also deeply ensconced in the U.S. political agenda. It's a bipartisan issue, and that's very evident in Congress. So I think either political candidate falls in on that scenario as president. Vice President Harris doesn't have a lot of experience in foreign policy, unlike President Biden, who has very strong interests and preferences. So I think she doesn't, to my knowledge, yet have clearly designated foreign policy advisors with deep Asia experience, certainly not on East Asia, China, Taiwan. So it's questionable whether they would be in her inner circle once they are brought in. I would assume their outlook is going to likely conform to past Democratic administrations, but that doesn't necessarily tell you anything if you compare, say, President Biden to President Obama, right? And again, that may be as much about the changes in China as it is in Washington. So Beijing thought that President Biden would return to a more accommodating policy like the Obama administration after 4 years of Trump and all of his assertiveness and disruption. So I think Beijing was quite surprised and in some cases very disappointed with Biden when he retained the tariffs that Trump initiated. He strengthened the alliance network, strengthened the Quad. He established AUKUS. He restricted and expanded the restriction of high-tech exports. And he's also actively encouraged reshoring, friendshoring to de-risk and supply chains, the CHIPS Act, the IRA. So Harris may not recycle the Biden playbook, but she can build on that already. So it's probably unrealistic for Beijing to think that the Harris administration is somehow going to be a different path and will suddenly start accommodating China, right? Saying, oh, yeah, we should cooperate and not worry about competition. I don't think that's going to happen. So I think Taiwan faces a slightly different risk. and that's that a Harris administration is overly deliberative, uncertain about how China will respond to actions that support Taiwan. That basically the calculus for deterring China is different, and I think there's a risk that Washington self-deters, right, and that there's a fear that whatever they do to support Taiwan might elicit a response from Beijing that's particularly violent or impactful, and I think that's a risk that Taipei is probably aware of. Trump. I mean, Trump is the essence of uncertainty. He fosters that intentionally. He takes a lot of risks. He ignores a lot of conventions. In some cases, I think that can be virtuous. I mean, Trump made an effort to normalize the relationship with North Korea. And if you think about the Biden administration, you think about the Obama administration, neither one took a risk to address North Korea. Trump was all about risk. And I think it was a genuine approach to change the status quo and change the paradigm, to offer him a very alternative future. And it ultimately failed. But I think that was indicative of what we might see. Now, again, Kim was open to it. There was support from South Korea. I'm not sure you have the same factors at play with China. So I don't think Xi Jinping is able to cut some sort of grand bargain modus vivendi deal with Trump. I don't think either one are prepared for it. So again, you've got the risk of uncertainty, the risk of how Trump communicates. You also have, of course, the risk of the conflation of his personal and national interests. But for Taiwan, you've got maybe a different calculation. One way to think of it is, the fat tail concept, right? The curve that lengthens at the ends, and I think the fat tail for Trump is really quite large at both of the ends. So there's huge risks with Trump, but there's also potentially very big rewards if you can get him on your side and give him what he wants. I mean, Trump is, I think, almost undoubtedly going to be surrounded by advisors that are very positive towards Taiwan and quite negative towards China, quite skeptical of China and the Communist Party. I mean, we've seen several of Trump's former advisors, call for recognizing Taiwan. I mean, that would be a huge coup for Taiwan. So that's the positive end of the fat tail. Of course, there's a big risk at the other side. I think there's a risk that there will be some in the conservative side of the political agenda who see value in supporting Taiwan because it's a good way to antagonize China, and that's their ultimate goal. And I personally don't think that's a very good approach. It's not consistent with U.S. national interests, but there are possibly some who would. So it's difficult to see how either administration will be good from Beijing's perspective, what they want. It's difficult to determine, whether Trump is going to be truly disruptive or simply ineffective. From Taiwan's perspective, I think Taipei is very experienced dealing with transitions from one U.S. administration to the next. They have a playbook for keeping those channels of communication open. And Taiwan's also particularly good at making its case for obtaining U.S. support, and they're also good at rolling with the punches, rolling with the breaks. So Taipei faces different risks from either administration, but they're accustomed to it, and I think they are resilient, and they're resourceful. So I'm pretty confident Taiwan will make the best of whichever situation it encounters.
Super, super interesting. Okay, so Drew, the things that you just talked about are in the context of the near term, a year, 2 years out. Would you sort of change your assessment or prediction, if you will, as much as you hate that word, if I were to ask you to look into the region a decade from now?
A decade from now. So where are we in 2034, 35? So Xi Jinping will be Biden's age today. Is he still in power or not? I think that's an important question to ask. What does his successor look like, and how did that succession take place? So I think that's an important trend to map. If we see Taiwan, if we see China as inevitably, consistently revanchist, angry, insecure, censoring all information within its borders, unable to let go of century of humiliation and Japanese history in World War II, if all of its relationships are still antagonistic, which is part Marxism, right? Marx was all about antagonism, right? Relationships between the superstructure and the base, between labor and capital. I think the Chinese see the world in very adversarial terms between the Communist Party and those outside of it. And I think if that continues, then what we see today continues. And perhaps the risks increase commensurate with China's economic success, its expansion of military power, possibility that its soft power becomes more attractive, though I think that may be antithetical to increasing Marxism in Beijing. Taiwan, demographics work against it. It needs to figure out, how is it going to protect itself, feed itself, clothe itself, if its population is shrinking at a steady rate. So either turn around your birth rates or figure out how do you assimilate some of these Southeast Asian migrants who are coming to live in Taiwan, a path to citizenship. And I think that's perhaps a little difficult for them to think about today. It's going to be increasingly necessary in 10 years. And of course, that puts it even farther at odds, as Taiwan would effectively be moving closer to Southeast Asia than to mainland China. So 10 years from now, that could be part of the paradigm, an increasingly internationalized Southeast Asian Taiwan. So the U.S. just exists, right? I mean, it's a country that thrives on chaos in many ways. People who want small government, you see cycles of strength and weakness. You talk to folks older than me who've been around, and they think the U.S. is full of chaos, but it's nothing like the 1960s, the civil rights movement in Vietnam. So the U.S. has a way of rejuvenating itself. Maybe 2 election cycles from now, we have 2 very capable candidates for president who can articulate a inspiring vision to the American people to pull together and continue to follow its values and lead the free world. It could happen. Or the cycles could deepen and strengthen. So I think I like to think of trends as being fairly consistent. It's just a question of their velocity.
Fair enough. Very good. We'll come back in 2034 and look back at what you said, Drew.
I can't wait.
Thank you so much for your time and insight, Drew Thompson.
My pleasure.
Thanks for our listeners and viewers for their time as well. Kopi Time was produced by Ken Delbridge at Splice Studios. Violet Lee and Daisy Sharma provided additional assistance. It is for information only and does not represent any trade recommendations. All 136 episodes of the podcast are available on YouTube and on all major podcast platforms, including Apple and Spotify. As for our research publications, webinars, and live streams, you can find them all by Googling DBS Research Library. Have a great day.